This next training video is around the Proportional Assist Ventilation Plus software, or as we commonly say, PAV Plus. What is PAV Plus? PAV Plus is a spontaneous breath type where basically the operator sets one primary setting of percent support. The machine actually analyzes the patient's compliance, their resistance, their flow, and their volume, and delivers a pressure based upon those variables, as well as giving feedback on the adequacy of the settings. This software is really intended for adult patients with adult circuit types. So let's look a little bit closer at the actual settings of PAV Plus. I go under Mode Setup. Now PAV Plus is a spontaneous breath type, so I have to hit spontaneous. It cannot be used in NIV, but rather only in invasive ventilation. So I'll touch my PAV Plus button, and here are your primary variables. So in PAV Plus, you don't set a total volume, you don't set a pressure, you don't set a flow, and you don't set a volume. And so the one setting, as mentioned, was the percent support. In this example, I'm set at 70%. That means the machine is going to try to calculate what 70% of the work is for the patient and deliver that from the ventilator. That means the patient is doing roughly around 30%. And so that is the primary setting. You have a flow trigger setting, an O2% setting. Now you have some other alarms here. You have high peak pressure alarm setting. You need to put in the right size diameter tube because once again it's going to try to compensate for not only the lung resistance but also artificial airway resistance as well. So I've got 8 in there right now, as well as the type of airway, whether it's an ET or a trach tube. And then you also have high total volume alarm limits for the spontaneous breaths because these are all spontaneous breaths. You have a PEEP setting, and then you also have an expiratory sensitivity setting which is set at 3. So I'm going to go ahead and hit accept here. And the software really has about a 4 or 5 breath start up here. So we'll begin to watch the screen. I'm going to change my scales just a little bit. And so right now it's putting on some plateaus. And as soon as you begin to see the PEEP eye and these displays popping up, it's gotten out of its startup. So it has to find what is that patient's compliance, what is their resistance, and then it's going to analyze their flow and volumes. Now on the display here we're seeing a couple things. We've got up on the top compliance for PAV, we have the resistance 6.5, and we have the intrinsic PEEP of 0.5. On the next waveform we're showing basically the circuit pressure with a gray shadowing of what we call as estimated lung pressure. Down below that we have a worker breathing bar, and that's where I want to spend a little bit of time here. So we have two kinds of worker breathing. We have the patient worker breathing and we have the total worker breathing. And this brings us back to understanding how PAV is really actually operating and working. When we think about that percent support of 70%, I mentioned that it needs to calculate a number of variables to determine how much pressure is it actually going to deliver. So right now it's delivering 27 centimeters of water pressure. And so when I look at that total work, that is really what we're saying is the estimated work the patient is experiencing. And that is a combination of the compliance and resistance of the patient and their flow and volume. So we're going to measure the compliance and resistance every 4 to 10 breaths, and then we're going to measure the flows and volumes every 5 milliseconds. And we'll actually adjust the delivered pressure within the same breath to try to keep that patient as comfortable as possible and try to maintain a support level of 70%. So right now we have the patient's total worker breathing way to the right side, and then we have the patient's worker breathing over here, and you can't see the values back there, but it's close to around 0.7. We have a green area, a roughly green area, which is a relatively normal area for worker breathing by the patient. Every patient may be different and they may have their own normal worker breathing levels. So make sure that complete clinical assessment is always made when adjusting primary settings in PAV. There are yellow sections around that green section, and then there's a white section. So right now my patient's worker breathing seems to be falling in the green area. So right now I'm at a 70% setting. This seems to be an area based upon my simulation where I'll probably keep this setting. Inside that little box there is an R and an E, a little red area and a blue area. The E area is really talking about elastic work, which is really talking about the volume and the elasticness of the patient. Putting those both together comes up with elastic work. And the one in the blue area is the resistant work, which is really the resistance of the patient as well as the flow at any given time. And so as I look at this, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple adjustments so you can kind of see how that worker breathing bar works. I'm going to go ahead and put the support, percent support down to 30%. And now we'll see that that patient's work has moved up significantly. So that percent support can be set anywhere from 5% up to 95%. So 70 is the default, 5% is the lowest, and 95 is the highest. Let's go back in and let's turn up that percentage again. Once you get to about 80%, there is a little continue button. I'm just going to stop at 80% here. And the software takes a couple of breaths to get back up to that 80%. So when it's going from high level down to lower level, it moves very quickly, but when it's moving from a low level like we were up to a high level, it takes a couple of breaths to get back up to that 80%. So you'll see that patient's work of breathing slowly move back down to the green area. So with the PAV Plus software, there's some really nice features about it that make it an interesting mode for many patients who have intact respiratory drives. Patients need to be breathing spontaneously. And basically, in this kind of scenario, we'll notice that right now I have the total volume on the bottom. If the patient makes a larger effort, takes a deeper breath, we'll find that peak pressures can change. So with small breaths, you may have a low pressure. A more aggressive breath, you'll have a higher pressure. So with this software, basically the software allows the patient to have a proportional amount of support. And that's why we call it Proportional Assist Ventilation Plus. So as they vary their volume, they vary their flows, the software will actually, within the same breath, adjust the delivered pressure to kind of keep up with basically their work of breathing that may have increased. So in summary of PAV Plus, PAV Plus is trying to promote natural breathing. It allows that patient to really control many aspects of the breath. So they determine when the breath starts, they determine how deep the breath is, they determine the flow of that breath, and importantly, they determine when the breath actually ends. So in this way, we try to return the natural breathing pattern back to the patient. Let's talk briefly about some of the alarms around PAV Plus. So if we go to our alarm screen, we can see that you have all your traditional alarms. You have your high pressure limits, you've got your rates, you've got your minute ventilations, you have your tidal volume alarms, both, actually the spontaneous one, the mandatory one is not operational. And then you have this high inspired tidal volume alarm limit. And so you have to watch this one and once again determine what is the allowable volume that you allow your patient to breathe. Once that patient actually hits that high inspired tidal volume alarm limit, it will actually truncate the breath. Let's see if I can simulate that here. Yeah, I may set it a little bit too high. I'm going to come down a little more. There we go. There we go. So it actually stops the breath as soon as it hits that high inspired tidal volume alarm limit. I'm going to reset that. There are a couple other conditions or alarms that could occur. If, for example, you had a leak in the system, it may have trouble finding those compliance and resistance measurements that it does every 4 to 10 breaths, and then it can't really find a good compliance and resistance value. So you might get a specific alarm related to not being able to find compliance and resistance. There is also an alarm that's called PAV Startup Too Long, and it may be associated with this same kind of condition. So those are some you may see. But the traditional alarms are the ones that, as the usual expected alarms that you will see. So any additional questions, please refer to the operator's manual for any of the technical specs or the description around PAV Plus software.